Today we're going to look at lesson 9.6, which is all about the quadratic formula. This formula will always be given to you, but here it is. Remember, if we're thinking about that equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, we've been identifying the letters A, B, and C for quite a while now. So we're still going to use that same concept. This is my quadratic formula. It's x equals negative b plus or minus. Under the square root, we will have b squared minus 4ac. And then that whole entire thing is all over 2 times a. Once again, that will always be given to you, but the big takeaway here is you have to identify A, B, and C correctly. And then we have quite a few different spots where we're going to be substituting in those numbers and then using our calculator to simplify. So let's do some practice. If I have x squared minus 4x plus 3 equals 0, to solve using the quadratic formula, we are going to identify the A, the B, and the C right away. Notice that when there's no number in front of the x squared, there's really a 1. So A is 1. In front of our B is in front of our x is the B value, which is negative 4. The number that does not have a variable is our C, so 3. So now I'm going to take those and I am very carefully going to substitute them into the formula that I just told you above. So x is going to equal, we start with the negative, and then in parentheses, we're going to put our b value, which is negative 4. Plus or minus, under the square root. First in parentheses, I want my b value, which is negative 4, then we want to square it. Minus, we'll keep the number 4, but then there'll be 2 parentheses after because we have 2 letters we need to substitute. We'll substitute in our A value, which is 1, and our C value, which is 3. This entire thing is all over 2 times in parentheses. We'll substitute in our A. Hopefully you're noticing that this is somewhat familiar to things that we've been doing in the previous parts of our chapter. If you remember, earlier in the chapter, we talked about the axis of symmetry, which was x equals negative b over 2a. There's that in this formula. There just happens to be a little bit more going on in the numerator. But the idea behind how we substitute all that stuff in is the same. All right, so we are going to start simplifying. Notice that the negative and then the negative 4, because you have back-to-back negatives, it turns it positive because a negative times a negative is a positive. Under the square root, this is where, once again, I don't care if you start using your calculator. You just want to start making sure you're putting everything in very carefully. So we're going to do negative 4 squared, which is going to give us 16. I see a subtraction sign, and that's the only negative. So I will be subtracting 4 times 1 times 3. That number is 12. That whole thing is all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Because we have some numbers that are being subtracted inside that square root, let's actually subtract them. Notice that 16 minus 12 is going to be 4. This is all over 2. In your calculator, if you take the square root of 4, we are hoping to see if that simplifies. And if you do that, notice that 4 plus or minus, when you take the square root of 4, we do get a nice number. The square root of 4 is 2. This is still all over 2. Once we've gotten to this point, we are almost finished with our answer. Because I don't see any square roots at all, and I see this plus or minus sign in the middle, that means that we are going to break apart this fraction, and we are going to have the following. So, 2 different parts when we break this fraction up. I want to take the numbers that are on the top, I just want to add them, and I want to divide it by 2. Then I want to take the 2 numbers on the top, I want to subtract them and divide by 2. So notice that in the first top fraction here, 4 plus 2 is 6. When I divide by 2, that means that one of my answers, I'm going to get x to equal 3. If I look at the bottom, 4 minus 2 on the top is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so my other answer is 1. Notice that because my problem starts with that exponent of 2, I should always have 2 answers. So notice that 3 and 1 are my 2 answers, which tells me that I did this correctly. Taking a look at the second problem, we've got negative x squared plus 3x plus 4. That equals 0. When it equals 0, that means that right away we are going to be able to identify the a, the b, and the c value. Remember, a is in front of our x squared. In this case, I see a negative, so that means we have a negative 1. B is in front of our x. I see a 3. C is the number that does not contain an x, so that's the number 4. Now that I have the values for A, B, and C, I'm going to substitute them into that equation up at the top. So that means we're going to have x equals. I want to start with that negative sign, but then in parentheses, I want to substitute in the value for B. Then we'll have plus or minus under the square root. I start with substituting b into the parentheses and squaring it. Then we will have minus. We keep the 4, but then there'll be 2 parentheses after the 4. We substitute in the a value and the c value. That whole entire thing is all over 2, and then in parentheses, I substitute in the a value. So once again, lots of stuff to substitute in, but as long as we're very careful and we put everything in parentheses, we're good to go. And now we can start trying to simplify by using our calculator. Notice that on the outside here, in the outside of the square root, I see a negative and then I see a 3. Because there is only one negative sign, I am going to keep that 3 negative. Then we'll have the plus or minus under the square root. 3 squared is 9. Notice that with my next numbers after, I see a negative 4, a negative 1, and a 4. Those are all being multiplied together. So because I see 2 negatives, a negative times a negative is going to make that a positive. 4 times 1 times 4 is going to give us 16. This is all over the denominator. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. Now I want to simplify the numbers in the square root. So I'm going to keep the negative 3. We'll have plus or minus under the square root. If I add 9 and 16, I'm going to get 25. This is still all over 2. Using your calculator, we should be able to take the square root of 25 and see if it simplifies. If it does, awesome, we can keep going. If it doesn't, then we're done with our answer. So if we take the square root of 25, hopefully we're all seeing in the calculator that we are going to get a nice number. We're going to get the number 5, which means because in the calculator I don't see a square root, we no longer need to write a square root. This is still all over 2. Just like the previous problem, because I was able to get rid of the square root, that means that I am going to continue solving this problem by splitting apart this fraction. So I'm going to have 2 different things to be focusing on. I want to take the top numbers, negative 3 and 5, and I first want to add them and divide by that negative 2. Then I want to take the negative 3 and the 5, and I want to subtract them and divide by negative 2. So negative 3 plus 5 is 2. 2 divided by negative 2 is going to give me negative 1. So one of my answers for x is negative 1. If I take negative 3 and subtract 5, I get negative 8. When I divide that by -2, I get +4. So here are my two answers because remember, like I mentioned in the first problem, because I see an x squared, that means that we are going to have two answers. And we did. We got two answers for x. Okay, taking a look at this third problem, we have 2x squared plus 10x minus 1 equals 0. Because we have it equal 0, we are going to be able to identify the a, the b, and the c right away. A is always in front of the x squared, b is always in front of the x, c is the number that is by itself. So once again, we are going to now carefully substitute this into the formula. Remember, the formula is x equals -b plus or minus, under the square root, we will have b squared minus 4ac, and this is all over 2a. So we will have the negative, and then in parentheses, I substitute in b, which is 10. Plus or minus, under this big square root, in parentheses, I want to take my b, which is 10, and square it. Minus 4, and then we'll have our two parentheses with the a and with the c. This is all over 2, and then in parentheses, our a value, which is 2. Okay, going to start simplifying. On the outside in the numerator, we have a negative, and then we have a 10. So that will stay -10. Plus or minus, under the square root, 10 squared is 100. Notice that the signs that come after, we have a -4, a +2, and a -1. So we have two negatives. Well, a negative times a negative becomes a positive. So I'm going to be adding 4 times 2 times 1. That gives me 8. This is all over 2 times 2, which is 4. Okay, I can start adding those numbers that are inside of the radical. So notice that 100 plus 8 is 108 under that square root. This is still all over 4. Now, if you then take the square root of 108 in your calculator, okay, depending on what kind of calculator you have, you'll either see a decimal right away, or you will see that the calculator has simplified this radical, but you still have a square root. Okay, so if your calculator turns it into a decimal, I am perfectly fine with you leaving your answer like this. Okay, or if your calculator does simplify it, it would show you 6 and then the square root of 3, and this is all over 2. This could be your other answer. Okay, we haven't quite gotten to a lesson where we're going to simplify radicals, so I would accept either one of these as your answers. Once again, if you have it turned into a decimal in the calculator, leave it as the square root of 108. If you're using one of the yellow calculators at school, then when you simplify, you'll get 6 root 3, and you can say that instead. So there are your two potential answers. Pause the video, please, and try this checkpoint problem. Okay, so hopefully you paused it and tried it. You should have gotten A to be 1, B to be -2, and C to be -15. So if I then start plugging things in, we should have the negative, and then in parentheses, B, which is -2. Plus or minus, under the square root, we will have our B value, -2 being squared, -4 times 1 times -15, and that whole thing is all over 2 times A, which is 1. Because we had back-to-back negatives, that 2 becomes positive. Under the square root, -2 squared is 4. Notice that we have two negatives. We have a -4 and a -15. When you multiply those numbers, it's going to turn into a positive number. 4 times 1 times 15 is 60. This whole thing is all over 2. I can add those numbers under the radical. 4 plus 60 is 64. When you put this in your calculator, you should see that it turns into a nice number. It turns into the number 8. So that means we are not finished like we were with the last example. I want to break apart my numerator. I want to think of it as 2 plus 8 being divided by 2. and I want to think of it as 2 minus 8 being divided by 2. Well, 2 plus 8 is 10. 10 divided by 2 gives us 5, so we should have gotten one answer, x equals 5. 2 minus 8 is negative 6. Divide that by 2, and you get negative 3. So there are my two answers. As far as going back to this last problem really quick, because we have this plus or minus sign, that does tell us that we have two answers. We have both a positive as well as a negative. So we do have two solutions if we have to write our answer like that.